Week 11 of the NFL season is officially in the books, and after another great week of games, let's go ahead and talk about the biggest winners and losers of Week 11. And to start this video off, I wanted to talk about one of the bigger upsets of the week, the Rams versus the Seahawks. This was a very weird game as through 3 quarters, the Seahawks had complete control of the game. It wasn't until the 4th quarter where that Los Angeles Rams offense started to come alive, but it honestly wasn't really like the Rams did anything special. The Seattle Seahawks just continued to kick themselves in the butt. Mistakes like the interception and the missed field goals ultimately why they lost this game. For the LA Rams, this is a nice confidence building win. I don't really know if this is necessarily a good win because the Rams were kind of competing for a top pick, but you still have Matthew Stafford, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, all these other stud players, so ultimately you do want to win games. And for the Rams, they wanted any chance to potentially make the playoffs. Sitting at 3-6 and now moving on to 4-6 is definitely a step in the right direction. Do I think they can make the playoffs? Potentially, probably not, but if they do make the playoffs somehow, I don't think they're necessarily an easy team to handle in the playoffs. They've been able to hold their own against some really good teams, so I'm interested to see how this team performs later in the season. As long as they have their head coach and Matthew Stafford, they're going to be fine. For the Seattle Seahawks side of things, this is just a horrible loss. Just a few weeks ago, the Seattle Seahawks were in the lead for their division, and everything started to feel like things were falling into place for them. Defensively, they were playing some much better football, and offensively, as long as they didn't make big mistakes and they were able to put up points on the scoreboard, they were probably going to win most of their games. And moving forward for that Seahawks team, that's going to continue to be the theme for their season, but this is a Seahawks team that is contending, quote-unquote. They have a veteran quarterback with a lot of veteran players, and sure, they complete their roster with some young guys going along with the older guys, which is definitely nice, but it's not like this team has so much youth on their side that they can wait and contend in a future season. This is their all-in season, and the next couple are going to be all-in seasons as well, and having a loss like this is inexcusable. They got completely swept by a pretty bad Los Angeles Rams team, and there's a lot of blame to be thrown around in this one. Drew Lock came in for the injured Geno Smith and played pretty bad. The run game continues to be a bit of a scary situation for Seattle, especially when they go up against some really good defenses, and as a whole, this roster has to learn to be able to close out games, especially against bad teams like the Rams. Are the Seahawks true contenders? It's hard to say. Will they make the playoffs? Probably, but we'll just sort of have to keep our eyes on the Seattle Seahawks team moving forward because this right now is not very good. But let's go ahead and move on to our next game, which is going to be the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Cleveland Browns. Now, I did predict the Cleveland Browns to lose this game because Dorian Thompson-Robinson was the starting quarterback, and while it was a prototypical AFC North matchup, the Pittsburgh Steelers ultimately lost 10-13 to the Cleveland Browns. For Cleveland, this is a phenomenal win. Defensively, you shut out this Pittsburgh Steelers offense, which is not very shocking to be honest with you, but you gotta win, and you're now 7-3 on the season, and your destiny is within your own hands. Am I concerned about the quarterback position? 110%. But for Dorian Thompson-Robinson to go out there and throw the ball 43 times, I like the fact they had some confidence in him. This was also a game where the coaching staff was able to have confidence in him, so maybe potentially Dorian Thompson-Robinson can start to grow confidence within himself. I guess the hope for this roster is that moving forward, now that DTR has a little bit of game experience, he's going to be playing better football, which if he can do that, this Cleveland Browns team is going to be a very interesting team, especially come December, January. I do think moving forward, this Cleveland Browns roster needs to use Dorian Thompson-Robinson's legs a little bit more, but the big story of the day was this Cleveland Browns defense being able to shut out that Steelers offense. You take away the Jaylen Warren run, that was an incredible play. The Steelers offense had 3 points, and they played about as bad as you can get. Najee Harris, Kenny Pickett, they gotta go. We already know Matt Canada's gotta go. I don't need to talk about that, but it's just time to be honest with ourselves. Kenny Pickett is not the guy. I recently made a video regarding the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I really didn't go into too much detail regarding Kenny Pickett, because honestly, I just sort of assumed that he was going to be the quarterback of the future, regardless of what I say. But he was drafted to be a top quarterback in the league, and he got outplayed by Dorian Thompson-Robinson, who was drafted late in last year's draft. And defensively, the Steelers did exactly what they were supposed to do. The Steelers had the game plan down to basically where they wanted it to be. What the Steelers' game plan is to win it in the 4th quarter by surviving the first 3 quarters. And they survived the first 3 quarters. And what happened in the 4th quarter? They didn't do a whole lot. The season is far from over for the Steelers as they have a really easy schedule moving forward. In fact, I wouldn't be shocked if they somehow become second in the division behind the Baltimore Ravens. But this is just a critical matchup that the Steelers had to have win, especially against a backup quarterback. Let's go ahead and move on to our next game, which I want to briefly cover because this was our Thursday night matchup, the Cincinnati Bengals versus the Baltimore Ravens. I've already talked about the Cincinnati Bengals in a separate video, so I'll go ahead and pin that video up right now. In that video, I talk about the Cincinnati Bengals and where I think they're going to go as a roster. But for the Baltimore Ravens side of things, this was another great win for them. They now sit at 8-3 and currently have a pretty strong lock to win the division. The entire AFC North, regardless of the Joe Burrow situation, is still going to be super tough moving forward. Effectively, I think the Bengals are very much out of the playoff race, but the Baltimore Ravens are very much, in fact, contenders. Even with the Mark Andrews injury going forward, forward, I still think this team has so much talent offensively and defensively. The versatility of some of their weapons offensively is going to be amazing come playoff time. The only real question regarding this Baltimore Ravens team is, can they really compete with the upper echelon of teams like the Kansas City Chiefs? In my opinion, I think they're the best team in the AFC, but we'll have to kind of wait and see to the playoffs. But let's go ahead and move on to our next game, which is another AFC matchup between the Buffalo Bills and the New York Jets. Similar to the Bengals, I also just made a video on the Buffalo Bills, but based on what happened this past week, that video might just be a completely scrapped video. In that video, I talked about the Buffalo Bills potentially heading in towards a rebuild, but they just demolished the New York Jets 32-6. And while holding the New York Jets offense to 6 points is honestly not that impressive, dropping 32 points on what is regarded as one of the best defenses in the entire NFL is impressive, especially day one of new offensive coordinator. And this is one of those games where this was a vintage Josh Allen performance. On the day, he was 20 for 32 for 275 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception. But truthfully, you can kind of wipe away that interception because it was just a Hail Mary at the end of the half. They also finally stuck to the run game a lot more this week. James Cook had 17 carries, Latavius Murray had 10 carries, and Josh Allen had 5. And you can sort of tell there was a bit more of an emphasis to establish some sort of balanced offensive dynamic. I'm hoping that this is not just a one-time thing because they were blowing out the Jets, and moving forward this will be a continuous thing they end up doing. But we're really just going to have to wait and see until they start going up against the upper echelon of units. As it goes for the New York Jets, another day, another misery. I truthfully feel so bad for New York Jets fans, because offensively and defensively you have so much damn talent, and for this offense to be as bad as it is just so frustrating. Let's keep it a buck with each other. Zach Wilson is not going to be on this team probably next year. There is no magical work that Aaron Rodgers can do to fix Zach Wilson at this point. He's just a bust. I think the Jets have to realize that, and I think they do. He was benched halfway through the game for Tim Boyle, who was 7 for 14 for 33 yards and also had an interception, and going forward I don't think this team's going to have that much success. The only way the Jets win is if they're going up against some other bad offenses, but when they go up against elite offenses like the Buffalo Bills or the Dallas Cowboys, this is the result they're going to get. It also doesn't help that Breece Hall had 10 carries for 23 yards. And I'll also go on record to say this: Garrett Wilson's been kind of disappointing for them this year. I know that you have to add context to the situation when you just look at his bare stats, because ultimately he is their only good receiver to go along with having a horrible quarterback. But doesn't it seem like every time he gets the ball in his hands, something bad happens? Maybe that's just been these past couple weeks, and maybe it just might be a biased experience for me, but I feel like whenever he gets the ball outside of like the Cowboys game, he has not been doing much with it. I'm not going to go on record and say Garrett Wilson is not a true receiver one option for this team moving forward, because until he gets a number one true quarterback, I don't think it's really fair to give an opinion on him. But yeah, I'm sorry Jets fan, this is getting bad. I have a few more teams I want to quickly talk about, and then we'll talk about our last matchup. I want to give shout outs to the Dallas Cowboys going in there and destroying the Carolina Panthers. I also want to give credit to CJ Stroud and that Houston Texans offense for taking care of business late against the Arizona Cardinals. And finally, I also want to give credit to the New York Giants and Tommy DeVito for having the best performance he's ever had in his entire NFL career. But the matchup I want to talk about in great detail is going to be the Minnesota Vikings versus the Denver Broncos. And in many ways, this is honestly a matchup that I was expecting to be very interesting, and it turned out to be. Both of these teams surprisingly have turned their season completely around. The Minnesota Vikings were riding a winning streak into this matchup against the Denver Broncos, whereas their opponent, the Denver Broncos, completely turned their season around after that Miami Dolphins game and now sit at 5-5 after a victory against the Minnesota Vikings. And there's a lot to dive into. I want to start off with the Minnesota Vikings and talking about their future. This was honestly a heartbreaking loss for this team, because the difference between 7-4 and 6-5 is just such a big difference. But for the Minnesota Vikings, you were without Justin Jefferson, and I honestly think had they had a Justin Jefferson, they could have won this game. Joshua Dobbs had some good moments, but he also had a couple bad moments. He had the one interception, and honestly probably could have thrown about 3 or 4 interceptions if they were actually caught by Denver. He also did have some spectacular plays that ultimately led them to scoring 20 points on the day. The run game was very weird. Alexander Madison did have 18 carries for 81 yards, but he also had a couple just boneheaded plays. The leading receiver this game was TJ Hawkinson with 4 catches for 55 yards. You do have to give credit to this Denver Broncos defense for doing some really good jobs against some of their best receivers like Jordan Addison, but you could really tell this offense just missed Justin Jefferson's presence in that receiving core. He's such a big body receiver, and he creates so many matchup problems, and I think, like I said, I think they win this game with him. Moving forward, this Minnesota Vikings team is going to be very scary. Do I think they can make the playoffs? 100%. Do I think they'll win a playoff game? Debatable. With that said though, they've taken many steps forward defensively, and offensively with Joshua Dobbs, they're still really good. As for the Denver Broncos, like I said, a complete turnaround since that Miami Dolphins game. It looked like late in this game that they were not going to be able to pull off a victory until Russell Wilson started playing really good football. On the day, Russell Wilson was 27 for 35 for 259 yards and 1 touchdown, and quietly, Russell Wilson is having a very spectacular season. Regardless of how the team is performing, Russell Wilson has continuously played really solid and not turned the ball over. And in a game where they could not establish any sort of run game, he relied a lot on Courtland Sutton to make the big plays down the field, and you gotta give credit to Courtland Sutton for making some spectacular catches throughout the game. And also give credit to Sean Payton and this Denver Broncos defense. It seems like for this team, after that New York Jets lost and after that Miami Dolphins lost, it just flipped a switch in that locker room, and for many different units and coaching staff, that would be kind of the demise of their roster. But since that embarrassment of a loss and since the embarrassment of the Miami Dolphins game, they've been genuinely good. They just beat a very good Minnesota Vikings team. They've also beaten the Kansas City Chiefs and the Buffalo Bills. I'm not going to believe too much in this Denver Broncos team because I don't think they can beat those teams in the playoffs. But given the current situation this roster is currently in, this is a huge step in the right direction. Offensively, they look sharper. Defensively, they actually look like a competent unit. And they could genuinely be a playoff team this year, which early in the season looked like a long mile from happening. Now, will this Denver Broncos team actually make the playoffs? That's still to be determined. At the end of the day, that wild card race for the AFC is down to a lot of different rosters, and I think Buffalo looks like they are kind of a lock for the playoffs now. So they're going to have to play some really sharp football moving forward. But if they do get into the playoffs, I tell you what, I don't think any team really wants to play them because they have an experienced quarterback who's won a Super Bowl as well as an experienced head coach who's also won a Super Bowl, to go along with a defense that's starting to click and play some pretty decent football. So Denver Broncos fans, I think there's a lot to be happy about, and NFL fans, let me know in the comment section below what you guys thought about this week of the NFL season. And if you guys did enjoy this video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button because it helps me out a ton. And of course, share this video to all your friends and family who may enjoy NFL content as well. But I love you guys. Peace.